In the landscape of American crime, few names evoke as much dread as John Wayne Gacy. He was the killer clown, a man who wore a mask of suburban respectability. He was a successful businessman, a popular children's entertainer, a volunteer in his community. But beneath this friendly exterior was a monster. Gacy was a predator of the most depraved kind. His crimes were a brutal violation of trust. They shattered the illusion of safety in a quiet Chicago suburb. The story of John Wayne Gacy is not just about a serial killer, it is about the darkness that can hide behind the most ordinary of faces. Gacy's legacy is chilling because it forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil is not always obvious. It doesn't always come from the shadows. Sometimes, it lives next door. It shakes your hand at a neighborhood barbecue. It poses for pictures with local politicians. Gacy was a master of deception. He built a life that was a lie. This lie allowed him to operate, for years, without suspicion. He moved through his world with confidence, all while his victims disappeared one by one. His story is a warning. It shows how easily we can be fooled by the performance of normality. The name John Wayne Gacy is now synonymous with the ultimate betrayal. He preyed on the vulnerable. He targeted young men and boys who were looking for work, for a ride, or for a connection. He used his position of trust to lure them into his home. A home that became their tomb. The details of his crimes are horrific. They reveal a level of cruelty that is difficult to comprehend. The discovery of his secret would send shockwaves across the nation. It would forever change how people viewed their neighbors and their communities. The killer clown became a modern-day boogeyman, a real-life monster hiding in plain sight. Understanding Gacy's case is essential. It is more than just a macabre tale. It is a study in deception, psychology, and societal vulnerability. It highlights the ways a predator can exploit the systems meant to protect us. It reveals the cracks in law enforcement and the biases that allowed Gacy to continue his spree for so long. The story of John Wayne Gacy is a stark reminder of the human capacity for evil. It is a story that, even decades later, continues to haunt us. It forces us to look closer at the world around us and question what lies beneath the surface. His case remains a dark chapter in American history. John Wayne Gacy was a pillar of his community, or so it seemed. He lived in Norwood Park Township, a quiet suburb of Chicago. He owned a successful contracting business, PDM Contractors. He was known as a hard worker, a man who provided jobs for young men in the neighborhood. He was active in local politics. He served as a Democratic precinct captain. He rubbed shoulders with influential people. He even had his picture taken with First Lady Rosalind Carter. On the surface, Gacy was the American dream personified. He was a self-made man who was deeply invested in his community. His public persona was carefully crafted. Gacy was outgoing and gregarious. He was the kind of person who made friends easily. He was a member of the local Jaycees, a civic organization for young professionals. He was named Man of the Year by the group for his volunteer work. He organized large parties and community events. His annual summer block party was a neighborhood highlight. He seemed to be everywhere, always eager to help, always with a smile on his face. This image of a friendly, involved citizen provided him with the perfect cover. It made him seem trustworthy. It made him seem safe. Perhaps the most famous part of his public identity was Pogo the Clown. Gacy created this character to entertain children at hospitals and charity events. He would dress in a colorful costume and makeup, performing magic tricks and making balloon animals. The image is deeply unsettling in retrospect. A man who brought joy to children was secretly a predator. Pogo the Clown was the ultimate mask. It allowed Gacy to project an image of innocence and fun. It disarmed people. After all, who would suspect a children's party clown of committing unspeakable acts? This duality is at the heart of the Gacy case. This carefully constructed facade was his most powerful weapon. It bought him credibility. It deflected suspicion. When people had concerns, his reputation often spoke for him. He was just John, the friendly contractor. He was just Pogo, the funny clown. This public image was not just a disguise, it was an integral part of his predatory strategy. It allowed him to get close to people, especially the young men he targeted. He used his business and his community involvement as a hunting ground. The man everyone thought they knew was a complete fabrication, a monster hiding behind a mask of civic duty and painted smiles. The 1970s were a time of great social change and anxiety in America. The optimism of the post-war era had faded. The country was grappling with the aftermath of the Vietnam War. The Watergate scandal had shattered public trust in institutions. Economic uncertainty and an energy crisis added to the sense of unease. In this climate, the suburbs were still seen as a refuge. They were supposed to be safe havens from the crime and chaos of the cities. Families moved to places like Norwood Park seeking peace and security. They wanted good schools, green lawns, and a strong sense of community. The Gacy case ripped through this suburban ideal. It introduced a new kind of fear, a fear that was intimate and personal. The monster was not some stranger from a faraway city. The monster was one of them. He lived on their street, he coached their kids, he attended their parties. This realization was profoundly shocking. It suggested that the safety of the suburbs was an illusion. The evil that people sought to escape was already inside the gates. The idea that a trusted neighbor could be a prolific serial killer was almost too much to bear. It violated the unwritten rules of community life. This was also an era before the 24-hour news cycle, DNA testing, and national databases for missing persons. When young men started to disappear, their cases were often treated as isolated incidents. Many of the victims were teenagers who had run away from home before. Police departments in different jurisdictions did not always share information effectively. Society was also less understanding of the risks faced by young men. There was a tendency to dismiss them as runaways or troublemakers. This lack of coordination and societal bias worked in Gacy's favor. It allowed him to continue his crimes for years. The fear that Gacy created was insidious. It crept into the daily lives of people in the Chicago area. Parents became more protective of their children. Hitchhiking, a common practice at the time, suddenly seemed deadly. Trust eroded. Neighbors looked at each other with a new sense of suspicion. The case became a national obsession. It tapped into a deep-seated fear of the unknown. The Gacy story was a dark fable for modern times. It taught a terrifying lesson. The person you think you know could be a complete stranger, capable of unimaginable evil. The quiet streets of the suburbs would never feel quite the same again. John Gacy's method was chillingly simple and brutally effective. He used his public persona as a lure. As the owner of PDM contractors, he frequently offered jobs to teenage boys and young men. This was his primary hunting ground. The promise of work and a steady paycheck was a powerful enticement, especially for those who were struggling financially or had recently moved to the area. Gacy would approach young men at bus stops, in town squares, or through his existing network of employees. He presented himself as a legitimate employer, a mentor figure who could offer them a chance. It was a trap disguised as an opportunity. Once a victim was selected, Gacy would use a variety of ruses to get them back to his house at 8213 West Summerdale Avenue. He might promise them a final paycheck, a bonus, or a ride home after a long day of work. Sometimes, he would use his interest in magic, offering to show them a trick. He was a master manipulator, able to read people's vulnerabilities and exploit their trust. The victims entered his home willingly. They had no reason to suspect they were in danger. They were walking into the lair of a predator who had carefully planned every step of his attack. The house was his domain, a place where he had total control. Inside the house, Gacy's friendly facade would drop. He would often use handcuffs, claiming it was part of a magic trick. He would then overpower his victims. His method of killing was disturbingly consistent. He used a rope tourniquet to strangle them. He referred to this as his rope trick. This method was intimate and brutal, requiring close physical contact and a chilling degree of control. Gacy was not a killer who acted in a fit of rage. His actions were calculated and methodical. He had a ritual. The act of killing was a source of power and gratification for him. It was the ultimate expression of his dominance. After the murder, Gacy needed to dispose of the body. For most of his victims, the solution was right beneath his feet. He used the crawl space under his house as a mass grave. He would bury his victims there, sometimes covering their bodies with lime to mask the smell of decomposition. When the crawl space became too full, he began burying victims elsewhere on his property. A few were even dumped in the nearby Des Plaines River. This gruesome disposal method allowed him to keep his crimes a secret for years. His house, a symbol of suburban success, was in reality a tomb. The remains of dozens of young men were hidden just inches below the floorboards. John Wayne Gacy's ability to avoid suspicion for so long is one of the most disturbing aspects of his case. He was not a phantom who operated in the shadows, he was a known figure, he interacted with law enforcement, he was even investigated for sex crimes years before his final arrest. In 1968 he was convicted in Iowa for sodomy with a teenage boy. He served only 18 months of a 10-year sentence before being released on parole. He then moved back to Chicago and began his life anew. His past was not a secret, but it was not seen as a red flag for the horrors to come. This was a critical failure. There were numerous missed opportunities and warning signs. The parents of some victims did report their sons missing. They sometimes mentioned that their son was last seen with John Gacy, or was going to work for him. But Gacy was a master of deflection. He would feign concern. He would tell police that the boys had simply taken off, that they were unreliable. Because of his standing in the community, his stories were often believed. The victims were often from transient or troubled backgrounds, making them easy to dismiss as runaways. The police were dealing with dozens of missing persons cases. Gacy's name just kept coming up, but the dots were never connected. Gacy was incredibly bold. He seemed almost to taunt the authorities. He continued his community work. He continued to hire young men. He even kept souvenirs from his victims, like driver's licenses and clothing. He felt untouchable. This confidence came from his successful manipulation of everyone around him. He understood how systems worked and how to exploit their weaknesses. He knew that police departments were overwhelmed and under-resourced. He knew that people were more likely to believe a successful businessman than the worried parents of a teenager who had a history of running away. The smell from the crawl space was another huge warning sign that was ignored. Visitors to Gacy's house often complained of a terrible odor. Gacy had a ready explanation. He would blame it on moisture, dead rodents, or problems with the sewer lines. Because he was a contractor, his excuses seemed plausible. No one could imagine the true source of the stench. The idea was simply too monstrous to contemplate. People accepted his explanations because the alternative was unthinkable. Gacy's greatest defense was the sheer depravity of his crimes. He was hiding in plain sight because no one's imagination was dark enough to guess his secret. The unraveling of John Wayne Gacy's world began with one missing teenager. His name was Robert Peast. He was 15 years old. On December 11, 1978, Robert was working his after-school job at a pharmacy in Des Plaines, Illinois. He was excited. He had just been talking to a local contractor about a summer job that, paid well. The contractor was John Wayne Gacy. Gacy had come into the pharmacy to discuss a remodeling project. Robert told his mother he was going to talk to the man about the job. He said he would be back in a few minutes. He was never seen alive again. Unlike many of Gacy's previous victims, Robert Peast came from a stable, loving family. His disappearance was immediately out of character. His parents wasted no time. They contacted the Des Plaines Police Department right away. They knew who their son had gone to meet. They had a name: John Gacy. This time, the police took the report very seriously. The Piest family was persistent and well-regarded in the community. The investigators, led by Des Plaines Police Chief Joseph Kozenczak, began to focus their attention on the friendly local contractor. The net was finally beginning to close. The initial investigation was tense. The police put Gacy under surveillance. They followed him around the clock. Gacy knew he was being watched. He played a cat-and-mouse game with the officers. He would drive erratically, trying to lose them. He would confront them, asking why they were following him. The police, for their part, were building their case. They learned about Gacy's prior conviction in Iowa. They began re-examining other missing persons cases where his name had come up. For the first time, investigators from different jurisdictions started to connect the dots. A pattern began to emerge. The turning point came with a search warrant. The police obtained a warrant to search Gacy's house. During their initial search, they found several suspicious items. They found a ring that belonged to a previous victim. They found a receipt from the pharmacy where Robert Piest worked, dated the day he disappeared. But the most damning clue was the smell. Despite Gacy's attempts to cover it up with air fresheners and cooking, the odor of death was unmistakable. The investigators knew they were onto something far more sinister than a single disappearance. They obtained a second, more extensive warrant. They were about to unearth the horrors hidden within the house on Summerdale Avenue. The second search of John Wayne Gacy's house began on December 21, 1978. It would uncover a scene of unimaginable horror. Investigators returned to the property with a singular focus, to find the source of the foul odor. An officer exploring the small, cramped crawl space noticed an area where the soil seemed disturbed. He began to dig. It did not take long to make the first gruesome discovery. He uncovered human remains. The search was no longer about a missing person. It was about a mass grave. The house on Somerdale Avenue was a tomb. The full scale of Gacy's crimes was about to be revealed to a horrified world. As the excavation continued, the body count grew. One after another, the remains of young men and boys were pulled from the dirt beneath the house. The work was painstaking and emotionally draining for the investigators. They had to dig carefully through the lime-caked soil, recovering skeletons, clothing, and personal effects. The crawl space yielded 26 bodies. More were found buried in the backyard and under the garage. 4 other victims, who Gacy had thrown into the Des Plaines River, were later recovered from the water. In total, the remains of at least 33 victims were linked to John Wayne Gacy. The news spread like wildfire. The story of the killer clown and his house of horrors became a media sensation. Reporters and camera crews descended on the quiet suburban street. The public was captivated and, honestly, repulsed. The details were the stuff of nightmares. A man who dressed as a clown for children's parties had a graveyard under his house. The contrast was shocking. The story dominated headlines for weeks. The house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue became a macabre landmark. People drove by just to stare at it, trying to comprehend the evil that had taken place within its walls. For the families of the missing, the discovery was a devastating confirmation of their worst fears. For years they had lived with uncertainty. They had hoped their sons might one day return. Now, they were faced with the brutal reality of how their lives had ended. The process of identifying the remains was long and difficult. Dental records and personal items were used to give names back to the victims. For some, identification took years. For a few, it was impossible at the time. The discovery in Gacy's crawl space brought an end to the search, but it opened a new chapter of grief and trauma for dozens of families. What drove a man like John Wayne Gacy to commit such monstrous acts? Understanding his psychology is a chilling and complex task. Gacy never showed any true remorse for his crimes. During his long hours of confession to the police, he spoke about the murders in a detached, matter-of-fact tone. He described his victims as worthless and nobodies. In his mind, he was not the one to blame. He constructed a twisted narrative to justify his actions. He claimed that the murders were accidental, or that the victims had brought it upon themselves. This complete lack of empathy is a hallmark of a severe psychopathic personality. Experts who studied Gacy pointed to a profound narcissistic personality disorder. He had an inflated sense of his own importance and a deep-seated need for admiration and control. His public persona as a successful businessman and community leader fed this narcissism, but it was a fragile ego. He was deeply insecure, particularly about his own sexuality. Gacy had same-sex attractions that he could not reconcile with the masculine image he wanted to project. His murders were a violent expression of this internal conflict. The act of killing gave him a sense of ultimate power and control over others, a power he felt he lacked in his own life. Gacy exhibited a classic double life. This is not uncommon in serial offenders. They compartmentalize their lives. There was John the contractor, the friendly neighbor, and there was John the killer. He seemed to be able to switch between these two personas with ease. He did not see a contradiction. In his warped view, his good deeds in the community somehow balanced out his secret atrocities. He once told investigators, "A clown can get away with murder." This statement is incredibly revealing. It shows that he saw his pogo persona as a tool, a license to operate outside the bounds of morality. During his confession, Gacy drew a map of the crawl space, marking the locations of the bodies with chilling precision. He referred to them by number, not by name. This detachment allowed him to distance himself from the humanity of his victims. He saw them not as people, but as objects for his gratification. He was the director of his own dark theater, and they were merely props. This psychological makeup, a blend of narcissism, psychopathy, and deep-seated rage, created a perfect storm. It turned a man who looked like a model citizen into one of history's most prolific and terrifying serial killers. His mind was a place where morality did not exist. The trial of John Wayne Gacy began in February 1980. It was a media spectacle. The prosecution laid out the overwhelming evidence against him. They detailed the discovery of the bodies, the confessions Gacy had made, and the testimony of those who had escaped him. Gacy's defense team argued that he was insane. They claimed he had a split personality and was not responsible for his actions. The jury did not believe them. After a short deliberation, they found him guilty of 33 counts of murder. He was sentenced to death. Gacy spent 14 years on death row, maintaining his innocence and blaming everyone but himself. He was executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. The aftermath of the Gacy case left deep scars on the community and the nation. The house on Somerdale Avenue was demolished in 1979. It was a symbol of such pure evil that it had to be erased from the landscape. But the memory could not be erased. For the families of the victims, the legal process provided a measure of justice, but it could not heal their pain. The lingering questions were agonizing. How could this have happened? Why were the warning signs missed for so long? The case forced a painful reckoning for law enforcement, highlighting the need for better communication and a more serious approach to missing persons reports. The Gacy case fundamentally changed how society views the nature of evil. It shattered the comforting myth that monsters look like monsters. Gacy looked like a neighbor, a boss, a friend. He taught us that the most terrifying darkness can hide behind the most ordinary smile. This idea has since become a staple of popular culture, but it was a shocking reality in the 1970s. The term serial killer was just entering the public vocabulary. Gacy, along with figures like Ted Bundy, became the archetype. He embodied the predator who walks among us, unseen and unsuspected. The story of John Wayne Gacy is more than just a true crime tale. It is a cautionary lesson about vigilance, trust, and the masks people wear. It reminds us of the importance of listening to our instincts and taking concerns seriously. It honors the memory of the 33 young men and boys whose lives were stolen. Their stories must not be forgotten. Remembering this case is not about sensationalism. It is about understanding the vulnerabilities that Gacy exploited. It is about learning from the past to better protect the innocent in the future. The nightmare of John Wayne Gacy serves as a permanent reminder that evil is real, and it is not always easy to see.